Just let me say that anything I'm going to talk about tonight have plenty of references. These are just some of the textbooks that I've written or co-authored or authored chapters in. Primary textbook, Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood. It's used all over the world, and it's been translated in Korean, which is what you see in the middle there. This is also a book, Disconnected Kids, came out with in 2009, and it really will summarize everything I'm going to discuss. So if we don't get through all of it, this is actually a home program that you can do at home, and it explains a lot of the science behind what we're talking about. It also has been translated into Korean and Chinese. This is a new book I just came out with, which is a follow-up called Reconnected Kids. We'll have some of these books available in the back when you're done, and I'll also be signing them if you're interested, but again, it'll get through it. This has been a great conference, been here for a few days. What I want to do is just start off by trying to focus on something. What I've seen is that a lot of people there's been so many different great lecturers focusing on different pieces of the puzzle, and I'm more of a right brain person. I'll explain that to you, which means I like to look at the big picture. So you've been through a lot of different conferences and lectures. How many people, just raise your hand with this, feel like you could stand up right now and tell me what is actually happening in the brain of a child with autism that produces the majority of their symptoms? How many people feel they could answer that right now? Okay. How many people feel they could not answer that? Okay. That's part of a problem, right? That's a little bit of a problem. So I want to see if we can change that. When you leave here today, you're going to have an understanding as to what's happening in the brain of an autistic child based on cutting-edge research and how that relates to the majority of symptoms that they see. So what we do and what we talk about in our program, what I talk about in the book is what's called the Brain Balance Program. What are Brain Balance Program? What are the centers? Essentially, they're learning centers. They're supplemental learning centers that focus on children only with disabilities. We work with children with ADHD, with high-functioning autism, with OCD, Tourette's, learning disabilities, dyslexia. The idea is that we look at all of these problems essentially as learning disabilities. Even autism is essentially a learning disability. Either the brain isn't learning how to function and learn academically detailed information, or it may not be able to learn how to function or learn emotionally or socially. Either way, it's a learning disability, and our goal is to optimize each child's ability to learn. And every child is different, and every disorder is different than the other. The idea is that we focus on looking at the whole child and identify their weaknesses in whatever area, whether it's motor function, sensory processing or detection, academic skills, cognitive skills, also looking at their behavior, and also recognize that obviously all of these children have unique physiologies that are not coincidental, that it's actually part of the same problem. It's not coincidental that they have motor and sensory issues and academic and cognitive issues, and that they also have digestive problems, inflammation, autoimmunity, any of those things. It's all related to primarily one underlying problem. And all of this is really directed, all of what we do, the program is directed towards addressing the primary problem. What is the primary problem in a child with autism or any of these disorders? It's known in the scientific literature as a functional disconnection. I'm going to explain what that is. When we talk about an epidemic, you know we're not exaggerating. I don't need to tell this group that we've seen a huge change. Roughly in the last 2 decades, we've gone from 1 in 10,000 to now conservatively 1 in 110. We know that the Korean study that just came out actually stated that in that country, using a population-based study, that it's now 1 in 38 in that country, 1 in 20 boys. And recently someone said this weekend that the CDC commented that if we did a population-based study here, we would probably see worse numbers. So obviously what we see is that we're seeing this dramatic increase. And you know that when people hear that for the first time, what we see is that most people say, well, it's because we're recognizing it more, there aren't any more children. But in Korea, what they found was they thought that it was 1% of their population. They found that it's actually 2.64 of the population, so almost 3 times more than it was. So, people have been out there saying, well, it's just that we're recognizing it better. I don't need to go through this because I've seen some good lectures on this, but we know that at this point, the best research pretty much shows that about maybe 25% of the increase over the past 2 decades is because of improved recognition, early recognition, diagnostic substitution, expanded diagnostic criteria, or even people migrating in certain states. That 75% roughly of the increases in autism and other disorders is actually a real increase, meaning that it's actually a prevalence, not just an incidence. So what we see is that there's a real increase, and when you look at that, you have to say that why, right? What is driving that? If we look at a dramatic increase, because any of the things that I've seen discussed over this weekend, one of the questions I ask is, okay, I see that that's the problem, or that may be an issue, but why is that increasing so much all of a sudden? If there are structural defects, why all of a sudden are there such a dramatic increase in structural defects? What we have to realize is that there's got to be more to it. There's got to be a big picture. So what is actually happening? What's driving this? We're told that these are genetic disorders, and by most people that means that it's a gene mutation, some sort of altered DNA. Why do we believe that? Well, because we know that autism, in fact, is probably the most inheritable disorder there is, meaning it runs in families, and we know that that it seems to be very highly inheritable. So the belief in the past was that it could only be inherited. You could only pass on something if you actually altered the genotype or the DNA. And we see that. Now, the only thing that doesn't seem to match with that is there's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. So how do you go up roughly 1,000 or 2,000% increase in less than 2 decades if you're looking at gene mutations? You don't get gene mutations that arise that spontaneously, and even if you do, in some cases where they're looking at what we call de novo gene mutations, which means that all of a sudden spontaneously we're getting gene mutations, obviously it would be the environment that would be inducing those gene mutations. So either way, the problem isn't a genetic mutation, the problem must be environmental. But how does that work? Because again, it seems to be inherited. And there also seems to be a specific profile of these children. Well, that's where the concept of epigenetics comes in. Epigenetics is the new buzzword. It's been around for a couple of decades, but it's really gained a lot of interest since the year 2000. And what we see is it means that environmental factors are intermingling with genes during developmental stages of expression, and the genes are staying turned off. And the genes that seem to be most affected are the genes that build what we call functional connections in the brain. Why are these genes affected? Well, it just so happens that they're the most prevalent genes, meaning we have 85% of the genes in the human genome are there to build the brain. And these are the most adaptable, modifiable genes that we have. The bottom line is we see that we're altering gene expression. We're not actually changing the DNA, and this is affecting the development of the brain during stages prenatally and throughout the course of potentially their life. Now, this is an issue because what we see is this is important for 2 factors. Because one is it means that if it's not a gene mutation, the thinking that these problems are not correctable in the long term may not be correct. The fact is we can turn these genes back on, and one of the things that typically turn these genes on are normal interactions with environmental factors that we'll discuss. So that means by utilizing various environmental factors in the right mixture or the right recipe, we have the ability to potentially turn on these genes. And this is the cutting edge thinking right now in genetic research, because after 25 years and 95% of the dollars looking for the bad gene, we've yet to find it actually. We have 20 some odd genes that are suspicious in children with autism that seem to be more prevalent, but what does that mean? Does it affect anything in particular? We don't know. And any of those genes are only found in roughly 1% of the population of children with autism. So the fact is we're not finding gene mutations, and we're probably not going to find gene mutations. We're going to find a network of genes that are being turned off and that can be potentially turned on, which means that these problems may be correctable. Now again, this is something that's out there. This was the cover of Time magazine last year, and you see it says, DNA isn't your destiny, and the new science of epigenetics reveals how the choices that you make can change your genes and those of your children. What does this mean? It means that what we found with epigenetics is essentially this, and I'm simplifying it, but that a parent can have their gene turned off for various reasons based on what they eat, what they're exposed to, stress hormones, their lifestyle mostly, because what they're showing here is that it's mostly lifestyle choices. It doesn't necessarily have to be mercury in fish, or it doesn't have to be toxins. Those things can play a role, of course, but the most common factors are probably lifestyle factors: exercise, physical level, diet, stress hormones, how we treat ourselves. And what happens is that if we turn off the gene in the mother or the father, even before they're pregnant, those genes can be passed on in the turned off position. So in this article, they go on to talk about how we've been able to trace that to up to 11 generations. So for instance, some of the studies that are done on rats, by simply altering the maternal diet before she's even pregnant, can completely alter the way the phenotype or the look of the offspring and their ability or their susceptibility to certain diseases for up to 4 or 5 generations, just by simply altering their diet. And again, if you read this article, there's a lot more on that. Essentially what happens is, when the brain is being built, you don't realize that when the child is born, they only have about 25% of their brain there. That actually the brain needs to be built. Why is that? Because if it was fully built when it came out, we would never get out of the mother's pelvis. So it needs to be small, and we need to make sure those genes don't turn on too early. So how do the genes know when to turn on? When they come in contact with the environment. What is the environment? Light, sound, temperature, taste, touch, movement, gravity, interaction and experience with other people. So the child is born, and we need to build the brain. Now, by the age of 3, that brain will be 90% of the adult size. So there's this massive growth that occurs over the first 3 years. How does that happen? It happens because genes are turned on by the environment. Now, most of that growth, however, is not adding new cells. We do not add, for the most part, new cells. In fact, we lose most of our cells, and most of that is during college years. But then we also lose a lot of cells throughout normal life. And what we see, though, is that the growth of the brain going from 25 to 90% is primarily 2 factors. One is we see that each cell, each neuron actually gets larger. It bulks up, it gets bigger, it builds more protein. We turn on the genes that code for the development of protein, that make the cells larger and thicker, which allows them to generate faster and faster electrical impulses. What we also see is we see the insulation around the cell. Those fat cells get more insulated, so the wire that transmits, that's basically the antenna. These are the wires that transmit. They get larger, and they also become more insulated, which allows them to send faster and faster signals, to coordinate to more and more areas. But the massive growth of the brain, going from birth to 15 months to 2 to 3 years, is the growth of new connections between the cells themselves, what we call functional connections that are built. And this is a process called neuroplasticity, and we never lose this ability through our life. Genes are turned on that build protein that eventually cause new growth of connections. Now, this isn't a long process. It's been shown that we can show changes in the size of gray matter in 2 hours after learning something. So this happens very quickly, and as these connections form, what happens is they start to reach out, initially to their neighbors locally. So as the brain is being developed, we see that the brain cells are growing larger, and all brain cells are equal everywhere. They're the same brain cells everywhere in the brain. They reach out to their neighbors to start to connect to one another, and as they do, they stimulate each other. They actually develop more connections. They grow more connections. As they start connecting to one another, they become faster and larger. Impulses become quicker. They're able to coordinate more and more cells to work together, and that's eventually how the brain grows and gets larger and larger and larger. When we look at the human brain, what makes it unique is obviously our intelligence, right? We are much more intelligent, most people are, than animals or other species. Where does that intelligence come from? What is the nature of intelligence? I just did a lecture a few months ago up at MIT to their artificial intelligence department, because after 30 years of the best minds in the world, they can't make a computer that thinks like a human brain. Why? They don't know why, because they don't know how the brain actually works. And this is very important, because this is why it doesn't work in autism. What we see is that it's not genes that make us so much more intelligent. We share 85% of the same genes as chimpanzees. We share more than 99% of the same as mice, excuse me. We share 99% of the same genes or more as chimpanzees. So why do we have so much more intelligence? Well, some people think it has to do with body size, that we have a larger brain per body size. But that's not true either. It turns out that most rodents have bigger brains per body size than we do. Many birds have bigger brains per body size than we do. So what is it? What we've come to realize is that there's two things that actually make the difference. One is that it has to do with timing and coordination, that our brains are the most coordinated brains on the planet. That as we're developing and our brains are growing and these connections are happening, we're reaching out to other brain cells and we're bringing and recruiting more and more brain cells to be able to come active at the exact same moment of time in multiple areas of the brain. So what we see is that as the brain grows, our brain becomes more coordinated, the impulses become faster, they become more connected. As they become more connected, we can recruit more and more cells to become active at the exact same moment of time. And it appears that when you're able to bring a certain amount of cells to bear and to come to threshold at an exact moment, within nanoseconds, that you cross over a threshold of processing ability at a certain point where you get this exponential leap in intelligence and what we call consciousness or self-awareness. So what we see is as neurons become larger, they become more insulated, they become faster, they start to reach out to their local neighbors within their own hemisphere and start to build these connections. And as they do, they're able to bring more and more connections together, more and more cells, and they form into networks that form larger and larger networks. And then as they develop more and more, they develop long-range connections, they shorten the short-range connections, and they reach across to the other hemisphere. And this gives us the second thing that makes human brains unique, is that we have an extremely asymmetrical brain, which means that the right and left side of our brain do completely different things. Now, other species, they have two hemispheres, but some of the most primitive species, like sharks and reptiles, they have two hemispheres, but they do the exact same thing. And in fact, what happens is, sharks don't go to sleep. So what happens is one hemisphere will shut down while the other hemisphere is awake, and then vice versa. Well, when we get to mammals, what we see is that the two sides of the brain don't do that anymore, and they start becoming different from one another. But in humans, we see that we have the most different brains, that the two hemispheres are completely different from one another. And what happens is that we have all of these cool little centers on either side of the brain that do completely different things. And what we can do is we can combine these two these areas in the two hemispheres together in unique ways, and that gives us the ability to do unique things with our brain. The key to that, though, is not that we're able to just activate these areas of the brain, but we have to bring these areas of the brain online at the exact same moment of time. So what we see, that coordinating all these cells, billions of cells to become active at the same moment, and being able to organize these unique different areas of the brain to come online at the same time is what creates the human level of intelligence. But what you realize is that the key to this is timing, meaning any little disruption in timing between networks in the brain is going to have a devastating effect on the human brain to function normally, especially if it happens during development of the brain itself. So what we see is that as the brain normally develops, we see that these short-range connections that are within the hemisphere to our local neighbors, they initially develop to form networks, then they have to actually become less, and these long-range connections between the two hemispheres especially need to come online to integrate these multiple areas to come together at the same time. What's happening in autism, one of the things we know is that they have over-connectivity of short-range connections and under-connectivity of long-range connections, especially between the two hemispheres. How do we know this? We also know that one of the things that we see is that the corpus callosum, or the bridge between the two hemispheres, is smaller in general in children with autism and ADHD and dyslexia. So essentially, the actual problem in the brain is this thing called a functional disconnection. Other researchers call it by different names, but I think we're all talking about the same thing. In UCLA, they call it developmental disconnection. In Carnegie Mellon, they call it desynchronization and underconnectivity. Uta Frith in Cambridge calls it weak central coherence. In Rutgers, they call it temporal processing deficits. Basically, we're saying the same thing, that basically the problem is the inability for large cortical networks on both sides of the brain to actually integrate and bind in time and space. And this actually leads to a major problem. Why does this actually happen? Why does this communication breakdown or coordination happen? And what we see is that the biggest disconnection is actually between the two hemispheres of the brain, because these are where the long-range connections form. This is where the bridge is smallest. So why would this happen? Well, what we see is that for one reason or another, normally when the brain is developing, both sides of the brain are maturing and growing at the same time, or at the same rate. And what happens is that normally there's an emphasis, though, of the skills of one side of the brain or the other. The first 2 to 3 years in the womb and the first 2 to 3 years of life, the right hemisphere is developing, and the left hemisphere is growing, but those skills aren't really developing in that side. So what appears to be happening is something during the first 2 to 3 years of life and in the womb is interfering with the interaction with genes, with the environment, whether the stimulation is not there appropriately or something is blocking that environmental stimulation from turning on these genes. And what's happening is genes are not turning on, they're not damaged, but they're not turning on to cause a normal growth and maturity of that side of the brain. But the other side of the brain is growing and maturing at a normal rate, and what happens is the processing speed in the networks between the two sides of the brain become too different so that they can't communicate with one another. There becomes too much of a breakdown. The speed difference, the timing difference is too off. And the reason why autism is so mysterious is, one of the things we know is that there's no actual pathology in the brain that we can see. There's no real degeneration, there's no damage, there's no actual injury in the brain. What we see is that certain areas of the brain look more mature than others. Some look larger, some look smaller. There's this weird growth aspect of the brain. There's something that's affecting the maturity of the brain where certain areas of the brain seem to be maturing at a normal rate or maybe even beyond a normal rate, while other areas of the brain are actually maturing and functioning at less of a rate. So it's like an old computer and a new computer, that one computer has a fast processing chip and it's working, and the other old computer has a slow processing chip. Both work, and they're not broken. They work independently, but they can't communicate together because they're at different processing speeds. And the thing about the human brain right now is we can't see timing. MRIs don't show timing, and we don't have the technology yet to actually measure brain cell communication on the nanosecond time scale, which is what we're looking at breakdown-wise. So the reason why it's so mysterious is because the primary problem is one of timing, and then the connections, areas of the brain that aren't talking to one another don't build connections to one another. So what we actually see is that this leads to a physical anatomical imbalance in the brain where certain areas of the brain are measurably larger or smaller than others. What we also see is that there's an electrical imbalance in the brain that we've measured in our lab and other researchers have showed, where we have what we call increased coherence or more electrical activity in certain areas of the brain along with less activity in other areas of the brain. We see that there's a metabolic difference where more activity or more blood flow in one area of the brain versus the other. And along with this, we see a functional imbalance, because one of the things that's been noted in autism and almost all of these disorders is that there's this unevenness of skills in children, or these islets of genius, meaning where they're not developmentally delayed in everything. That usually they have certain skills that are developmentally delayed, along with other skills that are better, and in some cases, way superior than their age. And the more different, the more severe the level of autism, the more severe the imbalance and the communication breakdown. But again, this is all happening without any sort of damage in the brain whatsoever. And again, what we know is that the corpus callosum, or the bridge between the two hemispheres, where these long-range connections reach out to the other side, is actually smaller. Now, it doesn't mean it's damaged, it's not injured in any way, it's just there's not a lot of flow and communication going back and forth. It doesn't mean we can't stimulate that flow of communication to increase. And again, this is something I'm not just talking about out of hand, this is from our lab. We're actually doing studies. This is the brain of an autistic child. And we're looking at what we see is not only an MRI, but we also look at a 3D recreation called tractography. Now, this is the right and left side of the brain. This is the right and left side of the brain here. Or even just looking at this, and if you looked at the amount of connections between one side and the other, do you see a difference? Yes, right? I mean, anybody can see. It may be subtle, but you can see a difference, that there is a difference in the connections between one side of the brain and the other. This is another one. Now again, just look at the amount of connections on one side of the brain and the other, and how many people see that there's a difference? You don't need to know what that means, but it shows a difference, right? Okay, now what does this actually mean again? This is cool for research purposes, but it doesn't actually tell us, what grade level is this child reading at? What's their reading comprehension? What's their behavior like? What's their social skills? It doesn't tell us what their digestive function is doing. So we need to look at other functional measurements. But essentially, when we look at something like autism or ADHD, and we say, what is it? What it is really, what we're looking at is unusually strong skills along with unusually weak skills, and they come together to actually form a very reproducible pattern that may be slightly unique in all children, but that it's reproducible. And what we see essentially in autism is that these children have unusually strong left brain skills with unusually weak right brain skills. And now again, it's not all or nothing, but that is the majority of what we're seeing. Now, dyslexia and most learning disabilities is the opposite, where their left hemisphere is delayed. Now again, why does this happen? Well, because if it affects the child during development prenatally, or the first 2 to 3 years of life, it's going to affect the right side of the brain. But then from 3 to 6, we're developing the left side of the brain. Then from 6 to 9, we're developing the right side of the brain. So if environmental factors affect the expression of genes during a particular window of development, we're going to see an imbalance that's going to develop in the brain. Now, the other thing that we see is, why does it happen in particular children? It's probably because they're already born with a little bit of an imbalance, because their personality type is that they're gifted. From what I've been able to see is that all children with autism, I think, are born very gifted with left brain skills. And if you take a child who has very good left brain skills, normally, if everything works out perfectly fine, their environment is great, what's going to happen is that they're going to be very high functioning, maybe a little bit on the nerdy side or a little bit, geeky, but they're actually going to be very high functioning, brilliant individuals that are going to do well academically. They may not be the most social person. But what happens is that if now something happens to affect their gene expression in functional connections during the first 2 to 3 years of life, that right side of that brain is too slow in development, and now the imbalance becomes too great, and the timing becomes too great that they can't overcome it, and this is a functional disconnection, and this is the problem that we see in the brain. Now, what we also know is that for the most part, if you look at the parents and the families of children with autism, that as you go up the socioeconomic scale and as you go up the education scale, you're more likely to have a child with autism. Why is that? Why would it be that as you actually have higher socioeconomic scale, or as you have a higher education level, that you're more likely to have a child with autism? It's because those parents are actually born with higher left brain skills themselves. So you see two professionals, two doctors, two surgeons, or people that are technology or computer-based, that are very highly intelligent people. They come together, they're going to have kids that are very left brain. This is a study showing that when you look at parents of children with autism, they have a tendency to have a higher verbal IQ, which is their left hemisphere IQ level. So now you get people that come together that have higher IQ, they tend to do better in school, they tend to get better jobs, they tend to go for more education. They have children that have more left brain skills, that born with a little bit of an imbalance, and then their right brain is not developing, and now you get autism. This is what I believe is actually happening. So to understand the symptoms that we see, all of the symptoms that we see, all we need to do is to understand what the right and left side of the brain do. So let's go through that quickly. What we have is the left side of the brain is all about details. It looks at the world as little pieces. It analyzes the world as little details, and what it's looking for is a pattern or a sequence. It's going to look at it one step after the other. It takes a little bit of time to do that, and it's looking to look one step after the other and analyzing and saying, what's the pattern here, so that we can predict what's going to happen in the future, so we can come up with the best action that we should make for the future. The right brain sees everything all at once. The right brain sees the whole world all at once. And it doesn't look at anything sequentially, and it processes the whole scene immediately, and it does it so quickly that we're not even really aware that we're doing it. The left side of the brain, again, controls the small muscle control, like typing or moving in a sequence, like playing the piano. Or the small muscles of speech, which have to move rapidly in a sequence. What we see is the right brain controls the big muscles so that we feel our body. It controls our muscle tone on our whole body. So if we have a low muscle tone, it usually shows a right hemisphere developmental delay where we don't know where we are. Our balance, our spatial relationship is the right side of the brain, where we are. We feel our body, our whole body, based on the right side of the brain. The left side of the brain also controls verbal speech or communication. So anything that has to do with verbal speech, reading, writing, spelling, vocabulary, receptive, expressive language is part of the left side of the brain. The right side of the brain is nonverbal communication, is the ability to actually look at people, and from just looking at their facial expression, eye contact, tone of voice, body posture, you know what that person's thinking, you know what they're feeling, or what we call theory of mind. You're able to understand, and this is the basis of all social development and social skills and relationships that we will form. What we see is that the left side of the brain, again, and when we look at children with autism, we focus a lot on the children that are nonverbal, meaning that they don't speak words at all. But the fact is the majority of children do speak words, and even children that are echolalic are actually pretty articulate with the words that they say. We know that children with Asperger's or high-functioning autism may actually be hyperlexia or hypographia, where they actually start to read signs or words or write spontaneously at 2 years of age, so that their left brain skills are very heightened. But 100% of children with autism have a nonverbal learning disability where they can't read facial expression or tone of voice, or they can't socialize appropriately. So the main problem is not a verbal communication problem, it's a nonverbal communication problem. And nonverbal communication is the foundation of verbal communication. So the reason why many children may have verbal communication problems is because they never formed the foundation of nonverbal communication. So if we're focusing just on trying to get them to speak, we're probably doing the wrong thing. So what we see is the left side of the brain controls what we call IQ or verbal IQ. The right side of the brain is performance IQ, or what we call EQ, emotional quotient. What we see is that the left side of the brain, again, is about doing specific, detailed type work. And when we see that we learn and we memorize things differently with both sides of the brain, the left side of the brain is what we call explicit or declarative memory, where we remember what we learn. We know consciously we're learning something. If I said, when did you learn about the Civil War? You can remember, the 5th grade with Mrs. Jones, she was my teacher. Whereas if I asked you, with the right brain, we learn implicitly or subconsciously, so we don't have access to the memory of when we learn things. But what we see is that we learn very important things with the right side of the brain, but we don't remember learning it, so we don't know if we didn't learn it. So if I said to you, when did you learn about social skills? When did you learn about reading emotions on other people or yourself? You don't remember that. Well, when did you learn that? Well, if I also asked you, do you remember before the first 2 to 3 years of your life? And you would say, no, I don't remember that. Why? It's called childhood amnesia, and it's because you don't have a left brain at that point. You don't form conscious memories yet. You only form subconscious memories that you don't have access to. But in the first 3 years of life, your brain is going from 25 to 90% of its size. So do you think that you're learning anything important during that time? Of course, it's probably the greatest period of learning in your life. But what you're learning about is social skills and nonverbal communication and reading emotions on yourself and on others. Because what happens is that as you're developing, we initially read emotions on ourselves. And we read emotions on ourselves so that we know, oh, I'm happy, oh, I'm sad. How do you know the difference with that? Well, some people would say, well, because I feel it inside my body. But the autonomic changes are identical for every emotion. The way we know the difference between emotions in ourselves is we feel our facial expression. We feel our body posture. We feel changes in our tension in our body. And then we say with our right brain, oh, okay, this is what I'm feeling. I'm feeling happy or I'm feeling angry. Once we develop that, we learn to read emotions on other people. And we do that by literally mimicking their physical posture, by mimicking their facial expression. We recreate their movements in our brain with our own body. But that means we have to feel our body. We have to be connected to our body. And the right side of the brain is what connects with our body. The right side of the brain feels our body. It feels our emotions. It feels our heart rate and our rhythm. And feels when we're sick to our stomach and says, uh-oh, something's bad. We're not doing the right thing. What we see is the left side of the brain, the right side control emotions differently. The left side controls what we call positive emotions. The right side controls negative emotions. Why is this? Because the left side and the right side of the brain also control all of our behavior. We have two basic behavioral platforms as humans, approach and avoidance. And the left side of the brain is about approaching the world. It's about going out. It's motor driven. It's about moving. It's action. It's going out. It's intention. We're going out in the world. We're analyzing the world, looking at it through little pieces. We're analyzing, looking for sequences so we can memorize it and go back to it and figure out so that we know what's going to be the next best action that we do. And to do that, we need to be motivated to do that, so we have what we call positive emotions. And there's actually only 6 basic human emotions. 3 of them are positive and 3 of them are negative. The 3 positive are happy, surprise, and anger. These are left brain emotions. We generate it with the left brain, we pick them up with the left brain, and it controls approach behavior. The right side of the brain also is governed by what we call withdrawal behavior. The right side of the brain is sensory in nature. It pays attention to the world around us. It looks for danger. And if we see anything dangerous, intuitively, subconsciously, we get sick to our stomach and our brain says, this isn't good. Get out of there. The left side of the brain loves familiarity. It loves to do the same thing. It loves patterns. The right side of the brain hates familiarity. It likes newness. So the right side comes into a new situation and says, like a bouncer, I'm going to check it out and make sure it's safe. And it looks around all at once, gets a gut feeling, and says it's not safe or it is safe. It says not safe. We have 3 negative emotions that motivate us: fear, disgust, and sadness, that say, okay, move away from this. It's not good. If we say it's okay, now the left brain goes, okay, let me go out and look at the world and analyze it and figure out what's going on and remember all these details. And the left side of the brain, once it stops, it wants to keep on doing it over and over and over and over and over again. And the right brain eventually has to come in and say, okay, stop. Don't do that anymore. You did it already. Let's move on to the next thing. Right? Or the right brain, because it's social, it's emotional, it reads expression, it reads situation, it will say to us, the left brain is always coming up with an idea, a thought, a word, a sound, a movement, and it wants to do things. It wants to move because it's motor. And the right brain says, don't do that. It's not the right time to do it. Or don't say that. You're going to hurt somebody's feeling. Or don't jump off that building because you're going to hurt yourself. So what we see is that the left brain is initiating something, the right brain is stopping it. When it can't do that, this is OCD, this is Tourette's, this is hyperactivity, this is ADHD. And we also see that it controls the immune system in the same way. One of the things that I haven't heard one person talk about this whole week, which is a big piece that we're missing, is that the brain controls the immune system. And the brain controls the digestive system. So when there's a dysfunction in the immune system and the digestive system, the actual cause in most cases is because of the brain not regulating those things appropriately. And until we deal with the problem in the brain directly, which means we first have to understand what the problem in the brain is, then we can't actually deal with all these other issues. Otherwise, we're just putting out fires. So how does it work? Well, the left side of the brain, as you would expect, is about activating the white blood cells and the immune system. So it turns on the T cells, it turns on the lymphocytes, it heightens the sensitivity of the antibodies, so that if we're under attack, the left side of the brain goes, okay, go attack it, those guys, go kill them. And the left brain turns them on. The immune system will react whether we have a brain or not, but the aggressiveness of the reaction and how long it goes on for requires a brain. So what we see is that the immune system reacts. If the left brain is strong and the right brain is weak, we get an immune system that's too strong. And what we see is we have an immune system that attacks. The right side of the brain stops the immune system, withdraws us from the attack, and also recognizes ourself. So it says to the body, hey, this is me, right? No friendly fire here. Left brain doesn't care. It's just going to attack whatever it sees. It's going to go attack it, and the right brain says, okay, this is me, because the right brain is about self-awareness. It's about feeling your body and feeling yourself in space and knowing who you are. And it recognizes ourself, and it says, okay, you're going to stop. You killed it now. It's over. Move on. If the left brain is strong and the right brain is weak, we get autoimmunity, we get chronic inflammation, we get sensitivity to foods and allergies that shouldn't necessarily exist. What we see is that this is true with everything, meaning like the left side of the brain activates what we call the Th1 system and all the different chemicals and cytokines that are associated with that. So what we see is that there's this imbalance between the right and left side of the brain that can pretty much describe every single symptom that you see in autism. And then also there's the digestive issue. And how does this work? Well, the brain, as we just heard before, controls the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. We are born with our sympathetic system intact. So we're born with our sympathetic fight or flight system going. So children have very high blood pressure and heart rate, and they have a shallow breathing, and they don't have a digestive system that works yet. As the brain matures and develops, and as genes get turned on and the brain becomes more coordinated and we develop a neocortex and the brain matures, the digestive system will mature and the brain will come down and will inhibit the sympathetic nervous system. If either the right side or the left side of the brain doesn't mature appropriately, the digestive system stays immature, and it does it in three primary ways, with the sympathetic system being high and the parasympathetic low. What we see is that we don't produce secretions. So we don't produce digestive enzymes that will digest proteins, and we also don't produce hydrochloric acid. We don't digest food and break down proteins appropriately to amino acids, which means that we're not going to be able to get neurotransmitters appropriately because we don't have the level of amino acid. We also see low muscle tone of the digestive muscles. So we don't churn the muscle, we don't churn the food up, and the child tends to be constipated. What we also see is we have reduced blood flow to the stomach lining and the intestinal lining, so that we have malabsorption, so they have nutrient and vitamin and mineral deficiencies. What we also see is because we have reduced blood flow to the lining starts to break down, and we all know that that creates leaky gut. We also see that with reduced hydrochloric acid in the stomach, we change the pH environment, which means that we're going to have yeast are going to be able to grow, or bad bacteria or anaerobic bacteria like Clostridium are going to be able to proliferate, and we're going to produce toxins. We also see that we don't produce bile and pancreatic enzymes like secretin as well, because this is again part of the sympathetic nervous system being high, and this is all well known and well documented. And what we see is we get a breakdown, we get leaky gut, and now the child eats food, They don't digest the proteins completely like gluten or casein. And now normally those large polypeptides wouldn't get through the stomach lining, but now they get through the stomach lining and they come in contact with the immune system where the left brain is high and the right side is weak, and the immune system is hyperactive, it's oversensitive, we get activation of these IgG and IgM antibodies, and it attacks the food with cytokines. It's not an allergic response, it's not an IgE response, it's an IgG response, and we get chronic inflammatory cytokines, and we get an imbalance where we have too much Th1 and too little Th2 typically. And this can describe all of the things that we've heard about from this weekend, meaning chronic infections or problems with B12 absorption or folic acid or methylation because of problems with malabsorption in B12. We see that, all of the things that means from methylation problems and sulfation problems. We're not able to detoxify appropriately because pancreatic enzymes and other issues. We're absorbing more toxins because the breakdown of the gut. And we have an overactive immune system that creates chronic food sensitivities and things of that nature. So what we end up with is someone with a right hemisphere underactivation is something like autism or Asperger's or PDD or ADHD. We have things like poor gross motor skills where they don't crawl, they don't meet their milestones, which are the first signs that autism is probably developing. They may not roll over equally. They have an asymmetry of muscle tone between their body. They may be distractible because, again, the right side of the brain is what pays attention to the world and its sensory. We see that they're impulsive because the left brain is impulsive. The left brain is typically hyperactive. It's motor driven. We see that they have lack of self-awareness because the right side of the brain connects to our body, helps to feel our body in space, and helps us to connect to who we are, and we get what we call embodiment. We have poor spatial orientation, so they're clumsy, they're awkward, they have low muscle tone, they have floppy muscles, they run in a funny way, or they look disconnected from their body, they feel disconnected from their body. They have poor nonverbal communication because they can't read emotions on themselves or other people. This leads to inappropriate social behavior because this is the foundation of all social skills and of relationships. They may be emotionally reactive because they don't really feel their emotions, just like they really don't feel pain. But then it builds up and all of a sudden it may just bubble over and then it goes away. They don't get the big picture, so they're stuck in little details, even when they're processing information. So what we see again is they don't really have processing deficits, they have processing imbalances. Children with autism don't hear low-frequency sounds that come from like tone of voice or emotional quality. But they're hypersensitive to high-frequency sounds, which are left hemisphere. The right hemisphere hears low frequency. The left hemisphere hears high frequency. The left hemisphere, tactile-wise, is about light touch, so they don't like light touch. But the right hemisphere is about deep touch, so they crave deep touch. The left hemisphere is about detailed vision, so a child will walk in here and see a little speck of paper that we would never see. They're hyper-focused on detail, but they don't see the big picture. They can't see facial expression or emotional reactions in the face. That's because the two hemispheres will differentially process this information. So it's not a true deficit, it's an imbalance. The imbalance itself is the problem. We see obsessive compulsive behavior because the left hemisphere can't be shut down once it starts. We see in school that the left hemisphere is very good with basic word reading. The right hemisphere is about reading comprehension or the main idea or pragmatics or humor. So a child may start out as a great early word reader. They're very good with the individual word or the literal meaning of the word. But then when they get to 4th and 5th grade and they have to look at the big picture, the main idea, or infer what the character's thinking or what the author's trying to say, they don't get it. So they hate reading. They love reading about books about facts and feet and trains and rocks and dinosaurs, but they hate chapter books like Harry Potter because they don't get anything out of it. Same thing with math. The left hemisphere is very good with basic math operations, so they may calculate things in their head, but they may have problems with his reasoning or spatial math like geometry later on because that's right brain skills. We also see that they have an overactive immune system, so they have food sensitivities, they have chronic allergies, and eliminating those foods and reducing that stress and we're trying to replace the vitamins and minerals and detoxify their body is all well and good. But if you don't deal with the problem in the brain where the immune system is out of balance and the digestive system isn't functioning, then you're just going to keep on doing the same thing over and over. What we see in our centers is when we're done with the child, when their cognitive skills match, when their motor skills match their age, that their digestive, their immune problems go away, that they can go back on a regular diet, that they don't have to be on vitamins for the rest of their life. I heard one parent tell me that they had a child on 75 vitamins. I don't care who's doing that. That's wrong. There's no reason why a child should be on 75 vitamins. If we are having them on 75 supplements, we're missing something. And what we're missing is the actual cause of the problem. And this is where, what I want to try to add to this is the idea that the brain is controlling this whole thing. And I have to say that for the most part, through this whole course of these last few days, I haven't heard anybody talk about the brain. I've heard them talk about the body. I've heard them talk about, the digestive system and the immune system and the structural system, and that's great. I went to a lecture on gut and brain, and the person never mentioned the brain once. So we need to understand that the brain is the most important issue. The brain is where the problem is, and that there is a crosstalk, but the brain could be responsible for all of the digestive and immune issues that we see with children. So the difference is we have two worlds out there. One world I come from is the psychology, neuropsychology world, where they look at the cognitive skills and the academic issues and the behavior, and they know nothing about the body. They know nothing about the immune system. They don't look at the motor system or the sensory issues. They don't even pay any attention to it. Then we have another world where we look at the immune system and the digestive system, and we look at, all of the motor system and sensory issues that we see in these children, but we don't talk about the brain and how that actually causes the specific cognitive issues. When you have metabolic problems, mostly what you see is metabolic disorders like toxins or infections. They tend to cause global deficits in the brain. But that's not what we see with these children. What we see is we see certain areas of their brain actually are functioning at a higher than level area, function, meaning some areas of their brain, we've documented that their brain is functioning at super speeds, while other areas of their brain are functioning at super slow speeds. How does that happen with a toxin? How is a toxin going to go to the brain and cause certain areas to function better than normal and other areas to function lower than normal? Does that make sense? No. So what we realize is that the toxins and many of the inflammation and inflammatory chemicals and vitamin and mineral deficiencies that we see are a result of the problem. They're not necessarily the cause of the problem. They may contribute in a large way, but they're not the primary cause. So if we're only dealing with those things, we're only putting out fires, we're not dealing with the problem. So we see that the brain, and there's 3 decades of research about how the brain, between the right and left side of the brain, actually controls the immune system, and we can see that. And there's very good research out there, and we're doing a lot of research on that now, showing that it actually controls this. So that decreased brain activity is going to increase the sympathetic nervous system and decrease the parasympathetic system, which can cause all of the things that we see with intestinal permeability. Let me just use an analogy with you to close, so that, because I'm running out of time because we were running late to begin with. This may all seem a little bit too easy still. It may seem a little bit, kind of contradictory. I'm saying that, all these children are different, all these disorders are different, but yet it's all the same underlying problem. Or that, it's just you stimulate the right or the left side of the brain. It sounds too easy. It sounds like, I've had people actually come up to me and say, I understand what you're saying. Like, is that possible? Because I thought I had to be completely confused, because autism is too complex for me to understand, right? So it makes too much sense. So let me see if I can kind of make more sense out of it to you and confuse you more. Imagine that we're in a symphony orchestra, and we have 100 instruments on the right side of the room and 100 on the left side of the room, and all of you play a unique instrument. And so when you play a symphony, very rarely are all the instruments playing at the same time, right? What happens is certain instruments on the left side and the right side of the room come up and they play together. And the key is not that the musician plays the right note, but that they play it at the right time, in the right tempo with everybody else, right? So just imagine that I'm a conductor and we're playing and I hear that the music's off and I say, something's off, I don't know where it is, but I know that somewhere someone's playing too slowly. So everybody, let's just play faster from now on. Is that going to actually fix the problem? No. That's kind of what medication does. It basically just makes the whole brain play faster, especially something like Ritalin, or louder. So now I say, okay, you know what, I realize that it's the right side of the room, that you guys on the right side are playing too slowly. There's someone here, I don't know who it is. So all of you guys just play faster. Does that fix the problem? No, it actually makes it worse, because now I'm taking the majority of instruments that are playing at the right tempo and I'm going to make them play at the wrong speed. So it's not just as simple as saying stimulate the right side of the brain or the left side of the brain alone and then support it with nutrients. So what I need to do is I need to say, okay, there's 5 instruments on the right side that are playing too slowly. I need to identify each and every one. I need to then give them whatever is necessary to bring that speed up so that they play together with the other instruments. And if I do, I fix the problem. If I only deal with 1 instrument or 2 instruments, I may improve it, but I'm not going to fix the problem. And if I leave 1 instrument out of tune, it may throw other instruments around them out of tune. So what I need to do is I need to fix all of them. So what's the difference between, let's say, ADHD and autism and the different kids within them? ADHD is, let's say, there's 10 instruments on the right side of the room that are playing too slowly and not playing together with the left side. But every kid with ADHD, it's a different combination of 10 instruments that aren't playing together. Autism, it may be 30 instruments or 40 instruments on the right side of the room that aren't playing together, but each kid with autism, it's a different combination of 30 or 40 instruments that aren't playing at the right tempo. So what I need to do on each child is look at them individually, analyze which areas of their brain are playing too slowly, and measure them based on age or grade level functionally, and then I need to do this proper type of direction and instruction to get them to function at the right speed with the other instruments. But again, the problem is always like in autism that there's always 30 instruments, it's always the right side of the brain, they're always playing too slow. But each one is different. Each disorder is different than the other, but the underlying problem is the same. It's this functional disconnection, and I'm telling you that that is the leading theory in the world right now, and you're going to see over the next couple of years that this is going to come out even more, but it should make you feel kind of hopeful because it kind of tells you, hey, you know, this means that I might actually be able to help all of these different things. And I'm running out of a little time here. But, you know, the idea is that traditional medicine, again, as we know, deals with acute care, symptom relief, and infectious diseases. Functional medicine was a great evolution, which basically we had chronic illnesses and we dealt with measuring metabolic functions. And actually, but the belief there is that these metabolic disorders cause brain problems. They can actually contribute to brain problems and can actually lead to certain symptoms. But in most cases, things like schizophrenia, autism, ADHD, bipolar disorder, the problem is in the brain, and then it affects down and affects the immune system and the digestive system, and then that breaks down, and then that creates the problem and makes it even worse. When we see an overgrowth or inflammation in the brain in autism, what we see is that the overgrowth is pretty much the same everywhere, which means the inflammation isn't the cause of the imbalance in the brain, because an imbalance in the brain, an imbalance in function, is the primary problem in autism. That's it. And so restoring some sort of balance is a matter of addressing that. And that's where the next evolution is what we look at as functional neurology, where we use everything in functional medicine and traditional medicine, but with a greater understanding of how to directly affect the brain and how we use nutrition to affect the brain, but how we use neurology to affect nutrition and diet and the immune system. The idea is to take a child who has an underconnected and desynchronized brain because they have an area of the brain that's processing at too slow of a rate, and because of that, they're not able to communicate, and they don't turn on genes that build those long-range connections between the corpus callosum, and by stimulating the weaker side in the right way, identifying what we need to do, and bringing those areas up, and also supporting the nutrition and eliminating foods and stress and all of the toxins that are there, we can increase the activity of that side of the brain, which will stimulate the genes to cross across to the other side, build those connections, improve the communication, and the good thing about neuroplasticity is once you develop it, you're not going to lose it. We've actually measured this. This is studies that I did on EEG measurement in our lab where we showed that there was increased activity, or what we call coherence, in the left side of the brain and underactivity in the right side. I presented that in Hamburg, Germany 2 years ago in the largest pediatric research conference in the world. We did the same research almost 10 years ago on looking at dyslexia and found the exact reverse relationship. This is an outcome study that we did a few years ago in the International Journal of Adolescent Health on Landau-Kleffner, where we showed that using a specific hemispheric-based program or curriculum that we were able to normalize the EEG, that we were able to improve objective measurements of academics, socialization, and behavior. This is a study an outcome study that came out last year from 2 of our centers. It was published in the International Journal of Adolescent Health, a fully peer-reviewed medical journal, that showed essentially children with ADHD, that we use behavioral scales and academic measurements, that essentially after 12 weeks, 82% of them no longer had ADHD by objective measurements. Furthermore, 60% had 2 grade level or more increases in multiple academic areas. 60% or 35% had a 4 grade level or more increase in multiple academic areas in less than 12 weeks by standardized academic testing. So the idea is, in the book and in our program, we use a multimodal program. We use everything. We don't just focus on one piece of the puzzle. You can't. You need to understand this imbalance is the problem, and we need to direct it towards an imbalance. We need to create an evenness of skills. It's individualized. Every child is different. We need to be able to restore timing to the brain. We need to do things at the same time, meaning that we need to look at light and sound and music and academic skills. We need to train the brain to work on those things together so that they work together as they're supposed to. It needs to be done repetitively. It needs to be progressively challenging. We do everything based on objective, quantified measurements. It's reproducible, safe, and long-term effectiveness. Again, I had to go through things a little quickly. I don't know. I think I ran out of time. I'm sure I have another speaker, and I don't want to go over as someone did with me. Yeah. We work with children up to 19, typically 18, 19. I've worked with adults. I've worked with brain injured people. If there's a functional imbalance in the brain and we measure that, it'll work with anybody no matter what age. But the difference is that children have learning disabilities. If this starts from the time they're born, they just don't learn things. Whereas adults, this is the same thing. This is what causes depression. This is what causes anxiety. But it's not necessarily a learning disability. It's an emotional imbalance. We look at maturity level of skills. So if a child has a specific motor skill, like fine motor skill, and we measure that they're actually doing it at a 5-year-old level when they should be doing it at an 8-year-old level. But they may have a gross motor skill that is actually like balance or coordination at something like a 10-year-old level. Or we look at sensory processing. They may be able to do certain types of sensory processing at different levels. Or academic. They may do word reading, which is a left brain skill at, let's say, 4th grade, but they may have reading comprehension at a 10th grade level. So we look at those things. So we're going to work on their weaknesses. We work on the skills that are immature, because literally, if a skill is immature, it's most probably because that area of the brain literally is that age. I mean, studies have shown that in ADHD, when you look at the brain of children with ADHD versus typical children, that a child who has a 10.5 age brain, by measuring all these 40,000 points, that a child is 10.5 years of age, an ADHD child's brain measures 7.5 years. That literally it's 3 years smaller. So it literally is immature. So we're measuring the skills to see where is this. And we're taking a skill, whether it's a motor skill or a sensory skill or sensory processing, and we're saying that skill we can look at basically being considered, related to one particular area of the brain. And so we're getting a functional measurement of that brain. And if we're changing the brain, we should also see a functional change in that measurement as the child's going through the program. Every child is different. Yes. No, we provide all the training. The only thing you need is special ed teachers. But what we do is we provide basically all the training because, again, they're learning centers. These are not healthcare facilities. We're not doing anything invasive per se. And again, we're not saying we replace therapists per se. What we're saying is we work on similar skills in this but in this holistic type of curriculum based on this one idea, which is this hemispheric imbalance or this functional disconnection, which is really the whole thing. I mean, as far as I'm concerned. And I think you're going to see that as more research comes out. I head up a research lab. We're doing studies all over the world right now. We're doing controlled studies. We have some major research coming out in the next year or so. Okay? All right, I'll be in the back. We have some books if you want. I'll be able to sign them. Thank you very much.